Learn here. I know for those of you on the West Coast, this is more of a breakfast and learn, but it's lunch for us here. So we've got some new staff in our department who are joining in as well. So as you zoom out, we have with us Sarah and Allison and Dahlia and Dave. There's some new staff in our department that are joining to learn alongside with you. Okay, great. So I guess we can just jump into it. So like I mentioned earlier, if you have questions, feel free to type them in chat or unmute yourself and ask. And we can either deal with that when you have the question, or we can, if that's coming up later in the presentation, then I'll just let you know that that's happening, and we'll cover it later. So without further ado, we can get started. So accreditation preparation, lunch and learn. So this is a workshop that we've run a few times. This is the third time I think that we're doing it in the last year. And it is to help ministry units have an understanding of kind of what is accreditation. You know, if you're coming into it for the first time, or if, you know, 3 years is a long time from review to review. So what is accreditation? Why do we do accreditation? And then talking about what to expect when you're actually going to be on review, as well as some tips to help you prepare when your review does come along. So that's kind of, I just gave you verbally the overview, but that is the overview of what we're going to be going through today. So what is accreditation? That's kind of the first thing I want to touch on. So accreditation is a review of processes and systems in place at a ministry unit. So accreditation is different from some other review processes you might go through. It's not an operational review. It's not an internal audit. It's a review of process and systems. The analogy that we like to use a lot of times is it's reviewing what we call the bones of ministry, those structural pieces that are in place to run effective ministry. So each ministry unit that's on the accreditation cycle gets reviewed once every 3 years. And it's a process that's based on evidence and documentation. So that's to say that for almost every standard that we look at, there's going to be some sort of paperwork or physical evidence to support that that's being done, in addition to you telling us about it. It's based on organizational standards. So a lot of what you'll see in the accreditation standards is what's expected organizationally based on our operating policies, as well as legislation, risk management, and identified best practices in each of the sectors that all of you work in. We currently have around 100 ministry units on the cycle. So those are social service ministry units. So dedicated social service ministry units, each dedicated social service ministry unit is on the accreditation cycle, along with a selection of core-based ministry, depending on the types of program that they're running. So why accreditation? I know that's something that a lot of people say, why accreditation? But it's a very important process that we have in place territorially and it encourages our organizational values that I have here. So hope by providing holistic care in the love of Jesus Christ. Service by encouraging excellence as units strive to support others and meet human needs. Dignity by respecting clients and staff through the maintenance of standards of care. And stewardship by ensuring accountability and integrity are fostered in actions, communication, and policy for sustainable ministry. Accreditation is a process that I like to say when I go to ministry units, it's really easy to get kind of caught up in the day-to-day of firefighting and just making sure that we can get from one day to the next and serve our clients and our residents as best we can. But accreditation is a process that allows us some intentional time to really slow down and look at the stuff that we don't necessarily look at every day, those structural pieces, and making sure those are in place and making sure that those are maintained. Accreditation also gives us an opportunity to celebrate what we're doing really well. Accreditation is a process that's used to kind of help us identify some things that we need to work on moving forward, but it's also a process that helps us identify what we're doing really well right now and gives us an opportunity to celebrate those. The standards can be used kind of almost as a kind of an orientation tool for new staff. It educates staff on the expectations of the organization. Kind of the basic expectations that we hope that each ministry unit maintains or meets are outlined in the accreditation standards. And it also provides a benchmark to measure performance. So a lot of ministry units will kind of look at themselves at one accreditation and then again 3 years later and say, wow, look how we've grown and look how we've changed, and look at how well we're doing in this area when that was an area that we struggled in before. So accreditation really gives us an opportunity to do that as well. So that's kind of what I call my sales pitch on accreditation, why it's important. I always say I become a salesman at some point during my presentation to try and convince everyone that it's that it's good, because it's something that I really believe in. So that's kind of what accreditation is, and why it's important and why it is something that we really value here at the Territory. The next piece that I want to jump into is going to be what to expect on an accreditation review. I see some familiar faces on the screen. So I know that some of you have already been through an accreditation, but I also know that there's a number of people online who have not been through an accreditation. So we're going to talk through what to expect during an accreditation review. And it can also be a helpful reminder for those of you who have already been through an accreditation. So the timeline. So the very beginning, if you go all the way back to the scheduling, actually starts around a year ahead of when your accreditation review will be taking place. I connect with the area commanders and divisional social services secretaries to schedule dates for ministry units. So that happens 1 year before, but if you're really looking at your ministry unit and you're looking at your scheduling, if you got reviewed in the fall of 2018, you're going to likely be on the schedule again in the fall of 2021, so you can kind of bank on that. The specific date doesn't get sorted until a year prior, but it does, accreditation runs like clockwork, so 3 years from your last review will be the same time frame that we usually try and go for the same season even, will be the same time frame for when your next review will happen. So that happens the year prior, closer to, so 3 months before, 12 weeks prior, we send out a notification letter. With that notification letter comes out a request for some documents to be submitted to us in the social services department. I'll go through what those look like in a few slides. So then from the notification letter, you have 7 weeks until 5 weeks before your review to upload that information and send it to ARMS to send it to us for review. 2 weeks prior to review, your schedule will be set. So you'll have a phone call with the team leader of your accreditation review from the social services department, and you'll be able to set the schedule for the days on site, so the specifics, and you'll be able to kind of get acquainted with your team leader and get to know the person who's going to be coming on site. 3 weeks after the accreditation, the written report is received, and 15 weeks after the action plan is due. I'll talk more about the specifics of that, but you can see kind of from notification letter time to action plan being due is around 6 months. So that's kind of the crunch time of when accreditation happens, those last minute preparations, the actual review, and then what you do after. So prior to an accreditation review, there's a few things that you can expect. Preparation is a huge one. Preparing for the accreditation review likely will be, or hopefully will be, an ongoing process, something that you kind of are mindful of in your day-to-day work, in your management team meetings, in your planning sessions. So it's an ongoing process. Like I mentioned in the earlier slide, kind of the crunch time will be those 3 months before your accreditation review when the notification letter comes out. So that'll be all the last minute preparation and getting ready for the actual review to take place. You will know when your review date is well in advance. So something that is helpful to think about is, when your review date is, work backwards from that to kind of see when you need to start preparing and when you need to start getting certain things done. The pre-review documentation submission request, which I kind of spoke about in the earlier slide. So that's things that you already have developed for the most part. It's not, you don't need to develop new things for this. You'll have a phone call with the team leader to discuss logistical details, things like setting the schedule, but also just simple things like lunch and where we're gonna sit. And we can also offer preparation assistance from within the social services department. So we have social services consultants, and now we've got more now, so that's great. So we can offer even more support. Social services consultants who are available to provide support to you as you prepare for your accreditation. So during the actual review, if you've not been on an accreditation review or not been part of an accreditation review, I'm just going to jump ahead quickly to show you practically, very practically, what the bulk of accreditation days look like is this, is sitting across the table from someone, having a conversation and showing them the paperwork to support the work that you're doing. So that's very practically what the bulk of the days are. Accreditation is kind of this big word that's thrown around and can kind of invite this anxiety or this questioning, but very practically, it is just having a conversation with someone on your review team and showing them the documentation that you're working on a day-to-day basis. Some other elements of the review team. So those people who are coming on site to do the review team, that's typically at very least going to be an accreditation team leader from THQ. That will likely be myself, Frank, or Tiffany Kwok, our colleague, and your area commander or divisional social services secretary. Some ministry units are larger, and the team will get bigger the bigger the unit is, but it's at very least going to be 2 people. And the review team has a few times peppered in where they're going to have to meet during the review. There's a management team meeting. So however you define your management team, at the beginning of the first day and at the end of the last day, you're going to have a team meeting with the management team at your ministry unit and the review team. That gives opportunity to talk about what the days are going to look like, ask any questions that you might have, and the one on the last day will kind of give a verbal summary of how things went. Those meetings are usually around 30 minutes in length, but they're the kind of set formal times for everyone to be able to come together at once. The next 2 are interviews and document review. That's what I talked about. Those are probably 90%. I'm not a statistician, but 90% of the days are spent in interviews and doing document review. So that's the bulk of the time spent on review. And then the summary meeting, that's the kind of end of the last day management team meeting that I was talking about, where it gives a verbal summary of how the accreditation went, some real strengths in some areas where there was some room for growth. What to expect after. So 3 weeks after your accreditation review takes place, you're going to get a written report with the ratings and comments for each individual standard. Now you won't get the scores, the overall scores for the chapters, but you will get the rating for each individual standard. I'll talk about the ratings and kind of how to read them and how to interpret them closer to the end. But this is just kind of what to expect after. So you'll get that 3 weeks after so you'll get what we call summary sheets, which are kind of typed up versions of what we saw on review for each standard. And you'll also get scanned copies of the actual physical chapters that we're writing on when we're on an accreditation review, which tend to have more detailed notes. So you can look at those 2 things side by side, and you should kind of have a full picture of what was seen at accreditation. And then action plan development. We'll talk a little bit more about action plan development after, but that's what to expect after an accreditation review. Sorry, I just need to have some water. So now we're going to delve into kind of how to prepare for accreditation, which is why you're all here. So that's what the webinar was called. So we're delving into that piece now. So the first piece that I want to touch on is kind of very simple, basic things, but as you may be aware, or you may feel within yourselves, accreditation can be an anxiety-provoking process. So getting these simple things out of the way and thinking about those ahead of time will be really helpful in hopefully reducing your anxiety on the days of review. Is there a space for the review team to work and for the review team to have those review team meetings that I was talking about earlier? Is there a quiet space for them to do that? Are there spaces available for individual interviews? I know depending on the ministry units, office space can be kind of a hot commodity. So is there a space for people to have the individual interviews? You know, if there are 2 or 3 interviews running at the same time, do we kind of know where people are going to be sitting? If I have to ask someone to move, hopefully I can give them a heads up and not do that in a panic. Will the review team need keys to get through the building? Will they need Wi-Fi passwords? Just those kind of simple things are good things to think about ahead of time to make yourself feel prepared and kind of kind of feel like you're putting your best foot forward, feeling organized coming into the review. Next is to prepare your staff. So the first point I have there is making sure that the point person for each chapter is prepared. So each accreditation chapter typically has 1 or 2 people that speak into it most heavily. So if you have an HR person, they're likely going to be speaking to the employee relations chapter, or your executive director will likely be speaking to the governance chapter. So making sure that the person who's going to be responsible for kind of having that major conversation with the reviewer and answering most of the questions is feeling prepared. And also having a look at those chapters and asking yourself if there are other staff that are going to need to be involved. You know, a lot of times administrative support positions are heavily involved in the accreditation process. So ensuring that they kind of know what might be expected of them, know what kind of documentation that they have to have gathered. Or if you're going to ask one of your caseworkers, for example, to talk through a client file with one of the reviewers, that they know ahead of time that they're going to have to do that so that they can feel ready. I don't think I'm very scary, but sometimes if you spring me on someone, they might feel nervous. So it's best to kind of have them feeling prepared ahead of time. And ensuring all staff know that the review is going on. So even if you have a lot of staff that aren't necessarily going to be directly involved with the accreditation review, they're not going to be talking to the review team, they're not going to be preparing for a chapter, we're still going to be in the building kind of walking around, poking our noses into different things. So making sure that all of your staff know why we're there and what we're doing there can help kind of ease the tension through the staff team. So where to start? The very first thing that I think is helpful in starting is going to be identifying which chapters you're going to be doing on the accreditation review. So I'm just going to jump ahead quickly to show you the list here. So here's all the chapters that we have. So we have 16. You'll notice the first 4 in red there, governance, employee relations, facility, and spiritual care. Those 4 chapters are done at every single review that we go to. So you can guarantee at your accreditation review that you will be doing those 4 chapters. And then the ones in blue, those are what we call program chapters. You'll be doing at least one of those. Depending on the type of service that you offer at your ministry unit, that will choose what chapter. So if you are a shelter, you're going to be doing chapter 15, emergency shelter. But we do have a number of units that are running, you know, multiple programs. You might be a shelter and you might also have a substance use disorder program. If that's the case, you'll be doing more than one of these program chapters. So at very minimum, you'll be doing 5 chapters, but I've done reviews with as many as 15, 16, 17 chapters. So it depends on how many programs you're running. If this is something that you're not sure of, or you're not sure if your programs are going to be done in 1 chapter or 2 chapters, you can connect with us here in Social Services Department and we can talk about your programs and let you know which chapters are going to be applicable in your setting. So identifying which chapters is kind of the first place to start. Something to be mindful of is if you're operating programming at more than 1 site, you're going to be doing the facility chapter, but you'll also be doing a supplementary facility chapter is what we call it, for each additional site that you're running programming out of. So the main facility chapter looks at things like, it looks at the physical scope and space of the building, but it also looks at policy. The supplementary facility chapter is more kind of making sure that each site, we do kind of a physical inspection and making sure that each site has a fire plan, each site has fire drills, kind of those practical pieces. So that is going to be applied at each site that you're operating at. And next, choosing who will be the point person responsible for each chapter. Again, this is something that's very different depending on the size of your management team and the size of your ministry unit. Sometimes you'll go on review and the executive director will be doing 4 of the chapters. But in some units, there will be program directors or program managers who are able to take care of those chapters, or business managers, ER people, depending on your sites. You're going to want to look at your team and kind of say, who does this fall under? Who does the bulk of this fall under? And who will be talking to the review team about this? So you'll want to choose that so that each chapter has someone who kind of has ownership over it. And it's not something that kind of slips through the cracks because it's not necessarily one person's full responsibility. So I've spoken about chapters. So that's kind of how we break up our review. It's broken down into chapters. Within the chapters, there are individual standards. So now I'm going to break down kind of the anatomy of a standard so that you kind of know when you're looking at this how to read it. So on the far left, yeah, it's everyone's left. On the far left is the standard number and the weight. The weight is either going to be regular, critical, or high risk, with the critical and high risk standards impacting the score more heavily than the regular standards. So that doesn't impact how we review the standard, but just letting you know that that's how our scoring is done. One column over is the actual standard. So this looks at what it is that we're looking for. So in this particular standard, it's looking at to ensure that the shelter staff have training in at least one of the identified areas here. So the standard is what it is that we're looking for. And then if you move one column over to the procedure, that outlines how we're going to measure it. So we're looking for staff training to be done. How are we going to measure that? We're going to look at personnel files and we're going to look at the staff training budget. So the procedure is a helpful thing to look at if you're kind of saying, I don't really know what to show them to support this is being done. I don't really even know how to show the team that staff training is happening. The procedure usually fairly explicitly lays out what it is that you're going to need to show the reviewer to support that that's happening. And then to the right is the rating. I think I talk about the rating more in detail a little bit later, but I'll just go over it quickly now. So there's substantial, partial, minimal, non-compliant, and not applicable. So those are the ratings. So when you're preparing for a review, what you want to be concerned with is the standard and the procedure. What are they looking for and how are they going to measure it? That's kind of what you're going to be focusing on while you're preparing. And the reviewer is going to be concerned with the rating. It's the reviewer's job to kind of decide if you were substantial, partial, minimal, non-compliant, or not applicable. Yeah. Okay. Where to start? So I think that something that's helpful is to look for quick wins. There is a lot of content in the chapters. I won't sugarcoat that. It is a lot. It's a lot of work and it is a lot of content. But if you kind of break it down, it can be overwhelming to look at it all at once. But if you kind of break it down and look for things that you already have. So in this list of the pre-review documentation that we ask for ahead of the review to kind of get an understanding of what goes on at the ministry unit, a strategic plan. Hopefully in most settings that's something you already have or you've already been working on. Your mission statement. That's easy. You've got that. An org chart. So these are quick things that you should be able to kind of collect and pull out from work that you've already done and not have to develop them newly for accreditation. So look for those quick wins and kind of gather what you can ahead of time. This pre-review submission, for those of you who have done a number of accreditations, you'll notice that it's kind of thinned out from years past. There was a lot of information that we were asking for, so things like SAMIS, financial statements. Those are the two that are jumping to my head. SAMIS and financial statements, those kinds of things. We're now accessing those from other departments within THQ. So this is kind of the very pared down list of what we actually need ministry units to provide to us ahead of time to give us an understanding of your setting. So in each of the accreditation chapters, as you're gathering your documentation, in each of the accreditation chapters within the first 5 pages, there's this list. And this list outlines kind of what documentation is required in each of the sections. So this is a good place to start. Rather than sifting through each individual procedure, this is a good place to start to kind of say, do I have this or do I not have this? You'll need to delve into the standards a little bit more to know what exactly we're looking for in that specific document, but this is kind of, so I'll use section 2 here as an example under mission. It's asking for a local mission statement, funding proposals, and an employee handbook. So if you look at this and you say, I don't have an employee handbook, well, that's something that you know that you're going to need to develop or that you're going to need to work on. But if you look at this and you say, well, I have an employee handbook, you can grab your employee handbook. You'll have to look in section 2 to see what we're asking for about your employee handbook. You know, are we asking that in this specific one, I do this a lot. I know the standard's kind of off by heart, but in this specific one, we're making sure that your mission statement is included in your employee handbook. So you'll need to delve into the standards to look at that. But this is a good starting point to say, do I have the bulk of this, or do I need to write an employee handbook? Is that something I need to do? So accreditation is a process that is kind of based in looking at evidence and looking at documentation. Evidence is what we document. It's not always something that's documented, so different kinds of evidence. Sometimes it's something that's posted in your ministry unit. Sometimes it's minutes from a meeting. Sometimes it's, you know, actually the physical space of your building, making sure that your windows aren't broken and you're, you know, that kind of thing. A physical inspection. So it's a process that each standard is looking for some kind of evidence to support that it's happening. So each standard will have something to support it. The interview process, the conversation, you'll be talking about each of the standards. What you'll be talking about is, you know, how do we meet this standard and where can you find the documentation? It's kind of like a tour, more like if you're tour guiding us through your ministry unit. So if I'm saying, I'm asking you about how you assess for community needs, you will say, well, I have this, you know, that we access this documentation, we access these reports, this is a survey that we completed, that kind of thing. You'll be having those conversations, but you'll be providing us with the documentation to look through at a later time. Documentation is essential to accreditation. We had a presenter at our conference in 2017 who said, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. And that was kind of her thread that she pulled through her whole accreditation preparation workshop, which was true in terms of what accreditation is. It's really great to be able to talk about everything, but accreditation is going to be looking at physical evidence. So if it's not written down, it's not happening as far as the accreditation review is concerned. So that's a scare tactic. I'm just kidding. It's Halloween, but that's to kind of say, you know, if you're having management team meetings or you're having staff meetings, and you're not really minuting them because it's not that formal. Accreditation is going to look for things like that. It's going to look for the documentation to support that those meetings are happening. So if that's something that's not happening in your ministry unit now, you'll want to start doing that as soon as you can. Evidence, I'll just pull out some examples of what it is, some more. We also look at personnel and client files. So that's another thing that we look at: policy and procedure manuals, health and safety equipment and manuals. So be sure to read each standard carefully to ensure that you know what kind of evidence we're going to be asking for. I just made a note on my paper, so I didn't forget to say it, but I'm just going to say it now because I will forget. When you're looking at the standards, it is, I'd say, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist is kind of the first rule. And the second rule is look at it early. Because there are some things that are talked about in the accreditation standards and that we're asking for and that we're looking for, that if you start looking at them 3 months before your review, when your notification letter comes out, it's not going to be possible to finish them. Things like a strategic planning process, that takes a lot of time and a lot of organization and a lot of work. So if you kind of know that that's something that you need to be working on, it's best to know that ahead of time. So if your accreditation isn't until 2022, it's still a good idea to have a look at those chapters now and kind of make a game plan. Another one that jumped to mind was community council. You're not going to form a community council and have quarterly meetings in 3 months. That's only 1 quarter. So those are some things that you're going to want to look at ahead of time. So I'd say the documentation and starting early to actually look at it and make a plan for how you're going to prepare for your review. So anyone who's done an accreditation knows how important policies and procedures are to the process. Policies and procedures are a huge part of what we're looking at. Policies and procedures in every section that we review. In your programs sections, in your governance, in your facility, in human resources, and in spiritual care. We're looking for policies in all of these areas. So that usually ends up being a pretty hefty manual. So if you don't have a policy and procedure manual at this time, or it's been sitting on the shelf and it hasn't been reviewed since 2002, that's a pretty big undertaking. So it's something to start looking at early as well. The standards ask that your policies and procedures are reviewed at least once every 3 years. So that's the first question to ask yourself. Are they up to date? Have we reviewed them in the last 3 years? Like I just said, when you have written a whole policy and procedure manual that covers all of these areas, it's a pretty big manual. So if you're going to say, in this July management team meeting, we're going to review all of our policy, that is likely going to be the worst day ever. And also maybe not possible. A lot of ministry units have a schedule set up. So they'll say, in May of this year, we're going to review our HR policies. And then over the summer, we're going to review our program policies, and kind of have a calendar and a schedule to decide when that will happen. So it's kind of an ongoing process. Not every standard gets reviewed at the same time, but they're all in a 3-year calendar to make sure that they are reviewed regularly enough. And also kind of assigning a point person to be responsible for walking through that section. So be it the executive director, or be it a program director, program manager, who's going to kind of ensure that that policy review is done, making it someone's responsibility to ensure that it's happening. It's important that all policies that cover material that's asked for in our operating policies are in line with our operating policies. So as much as it would be wonderful to write a policy that says everyone gets 12 weeks vacation as soon as they start, we have organizational policies that set those things. So ensuring that none of your policies contradict our organizational policies, making sure that they are in line with the OPs and they're not saying anything different is important. You don't always need to have a local policy to supplement operating policies. The operating policies govern us all, but in a lot of cases, you do need to write local policies for different things. One of the things I have up here is, are all the policies written? So that's something that you'll probably want to do, is go through all of the accreditation chapters that apply to your setting and make sure that those policies are written. I talked a lot about updating them, but they can only be updated if they already exist. So you're going to want to make sure that they've all been written, and that can be a big process to write down all of the practices that you have in your ministry unit. So that's, again, something to start early. Something that has been helpful for other ministry units that I've worked with and that I've spoken to and I've reviewed is matching the policy standards with your own policy and procedure manual. So some people will kind of take an accreditation chapter and look at a list of policies and write down their own policy number next to it. So I'll be asking for a non-fraternization policy, and you make a note of where that can be found in your policy and procedure manual. That's helpful to act as kind of a checklist to say, yeah, we've got it, we've got it. It also helps to kind of guide your reviewer to where to find those policies. If your policy and procedure manual is 300 pages, directing to the right section is helpful to make sure that nothing gets missed in your accreditation review. Also, speaking to nothing getting mixed, have a table of contents in your policy and procedure manual. That is my word of advice. It is very challenging to use a policy manual when you don't know where to find the policies. It's challenging for a reviewer, yes, but I am willing to take on that challenge. I will dig through a whole policy and procedure manual to make sure I see everything. But for your team practically to be able to use those policies and to make sure that they're actually valuable, a policy and or a table of contents is really important so that they know kind of where to find X, Y, and Z policy, and divide it into sections is helpful. Something to be mindful of when you're thinking about accreditation, a lot of people have their policy and procedure manuals online or on a shared drive, or even say, our staff has Lotus Notes, so they can access the operating policies that way. Think about your staff structure and think about if there are staff that don't use computers or don't have access to computers. Does your maintenance worker have access to the policies on the computer? You need to be sure that all staff has access to the policies, again, to make sure that they're most useful. So either giving them access via a computer or having a hard copy as well. Both of those are viable options. Yeah. So policies and procedures are a huge part of what's asked for in accreditation, and probably reviewing and writing and developing policies is one of the biggest tasks when preparing for an accreditation review. So how to organize your information. You can very well, leave everything where it is and just pull it out as the accreditation reviewers are asking for it, but that has a tendency to increase stress and also end up with a lot of things not being found when you're on accreditation review. So something that a lot of ministry units are doing and that is really helpful is having binders. So having a binder for each chapter, or I think I have this on the next slide, USB sticks. I'll just talk about them interchangeably because they're organized in the same way. You can have a binder, one binder per chapter, or a USB stick, and have them kind of one folder per chapter. Can be really helpful. Print out the pages of the standards to help organize the evidence behind the pages. That can be really helpful as you're preparing to kind of just be able to look and say, I need to put in here X, Y, and Z policies. And use tabs for organization. This sounds really simple, but it's a lot of work. It's simple to understand, but it is a lot of work. But it can help make sure that you really feel prepared and you're really sure that you have all of those pieces that we're asking for in the standards. So having one binder per chapter, kind of printing out the chapter, putting it in there, and putting the evidence behind each of the chapters, each of the chapter pages, can be really helpful. Again, table of contents. I love tables of contents. If you're going to take away one thing, I know I've talked about them so much, but having a table of contents can be really helpful. If you're going into update your accreditation binder, a table of contents will help you know, oh, I have these 3 sections that need to be updated because we've changed this policy or we've done this. So that can be really helpful. One thing to keep in mind is being sure that any sensitive information is not kept in a binder or a USB stick where it doesn't belong. Client and personnel files, we will come and look at those where they are. So wherever they're locked up right now, the accreditation reviewer will look at them there. You don't need to photocopy client files or pieces of files and put them in the binder. That's unnecessary. It's best to keep that secure information confidential. So just be sure of that when you're doing your binders. You can make a note. If you're doing a binder, you can make a note that says see client files in their cabinet, whatever helps you feel organized, but they don't need to be duplicated. So similar to policies and procedures, the accreditation binder or USB stick, kind of the hope is, or what I encourage is that is a living document that you revisit, that it's not something that sits on the shelves for 3 years waiting for your next accreditation, but rather you kind of are mindful of, if I update these policies or if I have done a new strategic plan, then I'm updating my accreditation information as well. At the time of your next review, it will feel a lot less daunting if you've already done that work. If you've already been updating as you go, it'll feel a lot less work, a lot less of a huge undertaking to have to update everything. So that's something that can be helpful rather than sitting on the shelf collecting dust. After your review, woohoo, it's over. That's what I say. No, I'm just kidding. Congratulations. Doing an accreditation is a huge amount of work, and it is a kind of a 2-day or 3-day or 4-day, depending on where you are, a very quick, condensed, that's the word I was looking for, a condensed review of a holistic picture of your ministry unit. So it's looking at a lot of work in a really short amount of time. It is cause for celebration. So I think be sure to find some way to celebrate when it's done, to congratulate your team and thank them for all of the work that went into it and all of the work that they do every day. Accreditation kind of marks a point where it gives an opportunity for that. So I think it's important to find some time to celebrate that. That's a value that I have, is celebration. And it used to be one of ours. I think it's really important. I still like to talk about it. Unfortunately, once you're accredited, or not, I'll just keep talking. Unfortunately, when your accreditation is over, that does not mean that the work is over. The accreditation review is over, but the next phase is action plan development. And then the third phase is action plan implementation. So I'll talk about action plan development. The action plan is going to address any standard that wasn't rated substantial or not applicable. So the action plan, ARMS, I've talked about ARMS. I'm hoping that everyone has heard about it, but I'll just briefly explain it. ARMS is our Accreditation Review Management System. It is an online system that we developed in conjunction with IT here at THQ that manages our accreditation process. So it's going to be where you upload the documents ahead of review, and it's also going to be where you do your action planning. So ARMS auto-populates your action plan with the standards that need to be included in that action plan. So you have 12 weeks after review to develop your action plan. That does not mean that all of the steps need to be completed, but rather that they need to be planned for. The third phase is action plan implementation. So once you've planned for all of your steps, once you've planned to address everything that was identified in your accreditation, you're going to have to implement those, make those changes, do that work. So that's really when the work restarts, is when you get to the action plan implementation section. Just like your policy and procedure manual and just like your accreditation binder, the action plan is hopefully not something that sits on a shelf, but rather is something that you revisit regularly in your management team meetings or in your staff team meetings, wherever it's appropriate to kind of talk about it to make sure that those things are being done and they are being taken care of. When you're going through your action plan, I encourage you to consider what's urgent and what's easy. What needs to be done right away because it is risky, or what needs to be done right away because it's vitally important and it's something that we overlooked. And what's really quick to do. Sometimes when I'm on site, something like having the social services code of ethics posted in your center, that you can do that in 30 seconds. So there's other ones, 30 seconds is probably, that's the shortest amount of time that anything can take, but there are different ones that are pretty easy and pretty quick to do. So look for those ones that can be done quickly and look for those ones that are really important and prioritize those when you're doing your action plan. And then there's some things will take a long time. You know, if you don't have a community council, developing a community council will take time, and having that community council kind of fall into a pattern of meeting regularly and meeting 3 times a year is going to take time. So that's something that, you know, I might plan for a year from now or 18 months from now. But there are some things that I can plan for this month or next month and work with my team to consider those. I alluded to this earlier, but this is when I'm going over understanding the rating. So when you get your written report back, there's a lot of letters on the page, and this is what they mean. So each standard's rating is going to be substantial, partial, minimal, non-compliant, or non-applicable. Non-applicable means it doesn't apply in your setting. Non-applicable is different from non-compliant because non-compliant means it's expected to be happening and it's not happening. Not applicable means it doesn't apply in your setting. So if you are a small CFS that doesn't have a kitchen, we're not going to be rating the dietary section of Chapter 3. That's a given, and that's okay. But if you don't have a strategic plan, the hope is that every ministry unit does have a strategic plan that's on the accreditation cycle. So that would be non-compliant. So that's kind of the difference there. I like to do it by percentage. That's the easiest way for me to explain it. Hopefully the easiest way for you to understand it. Non-compliant is equivalent to 0%, so no element of the standard was met. Minimal, less than half of the standard was met, but something was there. So if it's a list in the HR chapter of 20 policies and you have 2 of them, it's going to be a minimal. Partial, 50% to 99.9%. So again, in that same list of 20 policies, if you have 18 of them, it's going to be marked a partial because there's still some work to be done in that area. Finally, substantial, 100%, no work to be done in that area. Great job, give yourself a pat on the back. And those substantial standards don't need to be included in your action plan. The weighting, I kind of already went over this earlier, but when you're doing your action planning, we ask that you prioritize the critical and high risk standards ahead of the regular standards. I'll just reiterate that. We do go over this when we're on site doing your review, but just as a reminder. So the in-between. I kind of touched on this already, but don't let policies and procedures sit on the shelf. Don't wait until 3 months before your review to decide that you have to review all of your policies and procedures. That will be a regret, I'm sure. Build that into your practice. Build that into what you're doing already. a lot of the standards are about maintenance. So things like the strategic plan, the community council that I talked about, things like fire drills, things that we're hoping are happening on a regular and ongoing basis are important. If you scored 100% on your accreditation and then you don't touch it again, the next accreditation, your score will be significantly lower because a lot of the standards are about maintenance. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And that the action plan is a living document. So it's something that we revisit on a regular basis. Where to find resources. So we have a few spots where resources are found. The step-by-step guide, that's on Lotus Notes and it's on salvationist.ca in the social services toolkit. That provides an overview from start to finish of the accreditation process, from scheduling to action planning. It's a comprehensive document, it's a lot of pages, and it provides you with a lot of information about the process. So it's something to look at when if you're new to accreditation or you want a refresher, it's something to read through. The social services manuals on salvation. Okay, so these ones are on Lotus Notes. So we're still kind of operating in two places. We're operating on Lotus Notes while we have it, and we also have the toolkit online. But this is a pathway to the toolkit on Lotus Notes. So this is a screenshot of what it looks like. Here, there's all the accreditation chapters. There's the step-by-step guide. There's different guidelines. Hello?
Question. How long do we have Lotus Notes still for?
I'm sorry, you cut out. How long what?
Do we have Lotus Notes for?
Oh, good question. I don't know. Do you know, Frank?
Likely from IT, they're going to grandfather it a little bit. So even though we transition into 365, there will be time that we can still access the resources. But at this point in time, we try to have both. So in terms of accreditations, both documents that exist on Lotus Notes and also on My Army right now on salvationist.ca.
Okay.
You can ask one question.
Thank you. No, I'll wait. I'll wait.
Sorry.
That's okay. So the toolkit that we mentioned, it's kind of it's got tips and tools. It's what we have on Lotus Notes and it's more. So it has tips and tools for each of the pieces of evidence that we ask for in the accreditation. There is a sample on the toolkit. So you can find the pathway here. It's on salvationist.ca. You can sign in using your My Army information and you can peruse that and look through it and kind of pull what you need from there. And the social services department, some of the fine folks sitting with me here today, as well as our other staff, are available to provide support to you in a more specific and targeted way that specifically to your ministry unit, different than the toolkit, which is kind of more general and is applicable to everyone. They can kind of walk with you and work with you specifically in your setting to prepare for accreditation and to support you after accreditation once you're doing your action plan and working on that. Questions?